When winter's grip turns merciless, even the strongest walls can't protect you. One mountain man's obsession with warmth and survival would lead him to create a cabin that defied the coldest of storms, if only his ingenuity could save him from his own past. Before we dive into this incredible story, let us know where you're watching from. And if stories like this spark your sense of adventure, hit that subscribe button. Tomorrow's episode will reveal even more shocking survival secrets. The snow began its descent on Elk Ridge weeks before anyone expected it. What had started as a light dusting by mid-October soon turned into a relentless barrage. By November, the skies had darkened, and the cold was unyielding. The temperature dropped swiftly, forcing even the most seasoned trappers to hunker down. Samuel, a rugged man hardened by years in the mountains, stood in the doorway of his cabin, watching the flurry of snowflakes spiral in the wind. He was well prepared for winter, but something about this storm felt different, unnatural, as if the land itself was holding its breath. The cabin he had built was solid, but the wind howled, pushing against the wooden walls like a force determined to break through. The mountain men who lived in these highlands weren't strangers to snow and cold, but this storm, this winter, felt as if it might never end. Inside the cabin, warmth seemed a distant memory as the fire flickered weakly in the hearth. Despite the massive stack of firewood, it wasn't enough. Samuel pulled his fur-lined coat tighter and stared at the small window, snowflakes collecting thickly on the glass. He knew the danger that lay in the mountains, and as the winds picked up, he couldn't shake the feeling that this was a winter unlike any other. It wasn't just the storm that kept Samuel awake. He thought about the years he'd spent alone in the wilderness, trapping and building, scraping out a living from the unforgiving landscape. In the past, survival had been a matter of luck and instinct, but now it was something more. He had been wrestling with an idea for months, a cabin that could withstand more than the cold. He needed a cabin that could keep out the beasts of the wilderness, something that would stand firm against the claws of a grizzly, the weight of the snow, and the cold that seeped into every crack. Samuel didn't just want a shelter, he needed a fortress. As the wind howled outside, he made a decision. Tomorrow he would begin. The storm raged on through the night, blanketing the wilderness in an unbroken sea of white. Samuel lay on the rough cot he had fashioned from spare timber, unable to sleep. His mind kept returning to the idea that had consumed him, a new design for a cabin, one that could withstand the harshest of winters and the most aggressive predators. His cabin, though sturdy, was far from perfect. The logs were spaced too wide in places, and the roof, though solid, didn't retain enough. Heat. More importantly, the corners, weak points of most cabins, could be breached easily by a bear or even a man desperate enough. He couldn't shake the image of a grizzly clawing through the thin wood, the sharp sound of its talons scraping against the cabin's door. In the dim light of morning, he began his work. The fire crackled in the hearth, its warmth failing to push the chill from the air. Samuel's breath misted in front of him as he sat by his makeshift table, sketching plans. He drew lines and measurements, envisioning a cabin that would be stronger, warmer, and more secure than any he'd ever seen. He had built cabins before, many of them. But this one would be different. It would be the culmination of everything he had learned in the wilderness, every trick of survival he had perfected over the years. His first step was clear. He would start with the roof. In all his years, Samuel had learned one key truth about the mountains. The cold would always find a way inside. No matter how thick the walls, no matter how many layers of fur he wore, the cold was relentless. He needed a way to trap the warmth inside, to create an internal environment where the fire's heat could linger longer. That's when the idea hit him, the snow funnel roof. It was a simple idea, but revolutionary in its design. By shaping the roof in a way that gathered warm air and by preventing snow from accumulating on top, he could create a microclimate inside his cabin, one that would hold the heat in instead of letting it escape through the cracks. Samuel worked tirelessly that day, gathering tools and materials. As the storm continued outside, the cabin became his sanctuary, a place where he could turn his obsession into something tangible. Each log he measured, each piece of wood he shaped, was a step closer to the cabin that could save his life. But as the walls began to take shape and the roof rose above him, Samuel couldn't help but think back to the very thing that had sparked his obsession, the loss of his partner, John, years earlier. That night in the mountains had changed everything. John's life had ended because their cabin wasn't strong enough to withstand a bear's attack. Samuel's new cabin was no longer just about survival. It was about redemption. With the framework for the roof completed, Samuel stepped back and looked at the structure before him. The snow had stopped falling, and the sun broke through the clouds for the first time in days. He felt a sense of peace, but also a deep tension in his chest. This cabin was his salvation, but it would also be his test. Would it be enough to protect him, just as it was meant to? Only time would tell. As the days passed, Samuel's cabin began to take form in ways that felt both familiar and unfamiliar. The roof was an odd shape, unlike the typical peaked structures most mountain men built, but he could already feel the promise it held. His mind raced with possibilities. Each time he added a new component, whether a reinforced corner, a thick layer of resin chinking, or a carefully planned foundation, he felt closer to creating something truly revolutionary. Despite the progress, there was no time to rest. Winter would not wait, and the storm clouds were already returning. Samuel worked in the cold, often too tired to notice the numbing wind that howled over the mountains. His hands ached from cutting logs and chiseling them into precise forms, yet with every motion he grew more determined. This was no longer just about shelter, it was about survival in its purest sense. And deep down, it was about proving something to himself. The storm was only one threat he had to contend with. The mountains were filled with predators, wolves, cougars, and bears. And while he knew how to keep himself safe from the more common dangers, the grizzly remained his greatest fear. It was the one animal he'd never managed to fully outwit. As the cabin neared completion, Samuel found himself lost in thoughts of bears. He had seen firsthand the destruction they could cause, tearing through wood and stone with terrifying ease. One morning, as he stood back to assess the cabin, the ground beneath him shifted. A low guttural growl echoed from the trees. The unmistakable sound of a grizzly bear. Samuel froze. His heart skipped a beat, and a chill ran down his spine. In the distance, he could see the hulking shape of the bear moving through the trees, its head low as it sniffed the air. Samuel didn't panic. Instead, he stepped inside the cabin, moving quickly but quietly. His hands found the rifle that lay beside the hearth, ready and waiting. Through the small gun ports he'd built into the cabin's walls, Samuel watched the bear as it came closer. It paused, sniffing the air again, clearly aware of something in the vicinity. Samuel's pulse quickened, but he didn't fire. Not yet. The bear circled the cabin slowly, its massive form weaving through the trees like a shadow. It tested the air around the walls, pushing against the cabin with a force that made the logs groan. Samuel could feel the pressure mounting. The moment of truth was coming. Would his design be strong enough? Outside, the bear's claws scraped against the door. It wasn't an accident. It was testing, methodically looking for weaknesses. Samuel's pulse raced, but he remained still, keeping his eye on the animal, waiting for it to make its next move. For a moment, time seemed to stand still. The bear's growl was so close, it felt like the entire mountain was holding its breath. But then the bear stopped. It backed away, confused. It tried the corners of the cabin, sniffing and pawing at the logs. Still, there was nothing. No give, no weaknesses. Samuel's heart pounded in his chest as he watched the bear, now frustrated, move away. It wandered into the forest, its great bulk vanishing into the trees. Samuel lowered his rifle, his hands trembling. The cabin had withstood its first test. The design he'd poured his soul into, the idea born of loss and necessity, had worked. The walls held, the roof stood firm. The bear had not been able to break through, but Samuel knew this was only the beginning. There would be more tests, more dangers. The wilderness was unforgiving, and even the strongest walls couldn't guarantee survival. But for now, Samuel allowed himself a moment of quiet victory. The cabin, his fortress, had proven itself. The grizzlies' retreat didn't mark the end of Samuel's battle with the wilderness. In fact, it only fueled his obsession. Though the cabin had held firm against the bear's assault, Samuel knew that he couldn't afford to become complacent. Winter was settling in, and more dangers would come, perhaps even worse than the bear. His work wasn't finished. The final touches would determine whether his creation was truly impervious to the threats that lurked in the snow-covered mountains. He turned his attention to the details, the small, often overlooked elements that could make all the difference between life and death. As he worked, Samuel thought back to the other cabins he had built in his younger years. Each of them had been simple and functional. A roof, walls, a door, enough to keep out the wind and snow. But this cabin was different. Every log had been carefully chosen, every corner meticulously reinforced. This wasn't just a structure, it was a lifeline. His first test had been the door, and it had passed with flying colors. Unlike the flimsy doors most trappers used, Samuel had built one designed to withstand the brute force of a grizzly. He had spent days crafting it, ensuring that no bear could break through. The iron reinforcements, the interlocking wooden joints, everything about it was built to endure. Samuel's door was now a symbol of his defiance against nature's cruelty. The window, too, had been an innovation. Most mountain cabins lacked windows entirely, opting for small rawhide-covered openings. Samuel had designed a sturdy, high-mounted window, reinforced with canvas and resin, a clear departure from the makeshift designs most men relied on. It wasn't just about letting in light, it was about securing every potential point of vulnerability. The roof was perhaps the most radical part of his design. Instead of the conventional sloping roof most cabins had, Samuel's snow funnel design created a central peak that channeled the heat into the heart of the cabin. It was a design that had never been seen before in these mountains. The funnel-shaped roof allowed for the snow to slide off, preventing it from accumulating and weighing down the structure. But more importantly, it allowed warmth to be captured and retained, reducing the need for a constant fire. Each of these innovations was a reflection of Samuel's growing understanding of what survival meant in the wilderness. It wasn't about brute force or bravery, it was about knowledge, about recognizing patterns in nature and applying them to his own survival. The cabin wasn't just a physical structure, it was a testament to his will to live, to overcome. As the storm raged outside, Samuel stood inside his cabin, watching the flickering firelight dance against the walls. The warmth filled the space, a stark contrast to the bitter cold just beyond the door. For the first time in years, Samuel allowed himself to relax. The cabin was a fortress, but it was also a home, a place of refuge from the wild. He knew there would be more challenges, more trials ahead. But for now, Samuel had found something rare in the wilderness: peace. It wasn't the kind of peace that came from simply surviving. It was the peace that came from knowing he had done everything possible to protect himself from the storm. Samuel smiled to himself. The storm outside might be fierce, but inside his cabin he was safe. And that, for the first time in years, was enough. As the days turned into weeks, the cold deepened, pressing against the walls of the cabin with a relentless force. Winter had fully claimed the mountains, and the once gentle snowstorms now seemed like furious tempests howling down from the peaks. But inside Samuel's fortress there was warmth, a warmth that held fast despite the howling winds outside. Samuel had grown accustomed to the sounds of the wilderness, the creaking of trees in the wind, the howl of wolves in the distance, the occasional rustling of a bear searching for food. But now he had learned to listen for something else: the subtle hum of the cabin's defenses working, The roof's snow funnel design was proving its worth, shedding snow with precision, and the reinforced walls stood solid against the storm. Even the small window Samuel had crafted was holding up, strong, impenetrable, with not a crack to let in the cold. But despite the safety the cabin provided, Samuel's mind remained uneasy. His thoughts often drifted back to the loss of John, his partner, who had died that fateful day at the hands of the bear. He couldn't shake the memory, the look of terror in John's eyes, the emptiness left in the cabin after he had buried his friend. Every time the wind howled, every time the cabin groaned under the pressure of the storm, Samuel was reminded of the fine line between life and death that existed out here. The isolation of the mountain was beginning to weigh on him. Though his cabin was a marvel of design, it didn't fill the emptiness inside him. The stillness of the wilderness had started to feel like a shackle, not a refuge. Samuel had spent years alone in the wilds, but now, for the first time, he questioned whether the safety of the cabin was enough to ease the loneliness. One night, as he sat by the fire, the crackling flames casting flickering shadows on the walls, a knock came at the door. Samuel's hand instinctively went to the rifle beside him, his heart skipping a beat. Who could be out here in this storm? It was too late in the season for travelers. Cautiously he rose to his feet and approached the door, his boots crunching softly on the cold wooden floor. Another knock, louder this time, followed by a voice. "Samuel, are you in there?" The voice was familiar, rough and wind-blown. It was William Marshall, a trapper Samuel had known briefly in the past. Samuel hesitated for a moment, then swung open the door, finding William standing in the snow, his face pale from the cold. The wind whipped his coat around him, and his breath came out in thick clouds. "Come in, quick," Samuel said, stepping aside to let him inside. William stumbled into the warmth of the cabin, his boots clattering on the floor as he shed his outer layers. "What are you doing out here in this storm?" Samuel asked, his voice steady but laced with concern. I need your help," William said, his teeth chattering. "I've lost my cabin. A bear attacked it. It tore everything apart." Samuel's heart sank. He knew what William was saying without needing the details. A bear, the very same terror he had spent years trying to escape. The irony was not lost on him. Here in his fortress he was untouched, yet his neighbor, a few miles away, had suffered the same fate Samuel feared for so long. As William warmed himself by the fire, Samuel considered the weight of the situation. He had built his cabin to withstand attacks, but he had never truly considered what it meant to share his knowledge. In the wilderness, men guarded their secrets like gold. Samuel, however, was different. He couldn't help but feel responsible for William's loss. He had found safety, but had he done enough to ensure others could survive the same dangers? "I'll help you rebuild," Samuel said after a long pause. "But you'll need to do it the way I've done it. No shortcuts. No cutting corners." William looked up at him, his face still haunted by the attack. "Anything," he said, his voice full of gratitude. Samuel nodded. He had never thought he would share his cabin secrets with another man, but now, in the midst of the storm and William's desperation, he knew what he had to do. Survival in the mountains was about more than building walls. It was about building a community of people who could endure together. The days following William's arrival were spent in a blur of activity. Samuel worked tirelessly, showing William the steps he had taken to build his own fortress, every log measured, every corner reinforced, every detail meticulously planned. Together, they worked on a new cabin for William, one that would withstand the same dangers that had claimed his first home. The process was slow but steady. William was a quick learner, but Samuel found himself pushing the other man to follow each step with the same precision he had used in his own cabin. They spent hours cutting logs, fitting them into place, and carefully chinking the walls with the clay and resin mixture that had proven so effective in Samuel's structure. Every task was a lesson. Every decision a reminder of how much effort went into making the cabin strong enough to survive. Yet, as the days wore on, Samuel felt a growing unease. The work had been satisfying, but there was a cost. Each moment spent teaching William felt like a moment lost from his own solitude, and Samuel found that he craved the quiet of his cabin again. He had always been a man of action, but the presence of another person brought with it a new set of challenges. The peaceful isolation he had once relished now seemed distant, replaced by the uncomfortable awareness of another's vulnerability. By the time they finished the new cabin, Samuel had come to a painful realization. The mountain was a place where survival was earned through effort, but it also demanded sacrifices. The more he worked with William, the more Samuel understood that his innovation, his cabin, his fortress, wasn't just about protection, it was about control. By building the cabin, he had gained control over his environment, but by sharing it, he had given away something precious. The cabin stood at the top of the ridge, a testament to both Samuel's genius and his growing discomfort with his own success. He had created something that could save lives, but in doing so, he had exposed himself to the very thing he had feared most, the dependence of others. In the wilderness, there was no room for weakness, and yet here he was, faced with the reality that survival didn't always come with a clear price tag. As he watched William settle into his new home, Samuel couldn't help but feel a pang of regret. He had done the right thing, but the cost was higher than he had expected. And for the first time, Samuel wondered if he had built a life that was too secure, too isolating, to ever truly be shared with others. But the winter raged on, and Samuel knew that survival required not just ingenuity, but adaptation. He had learned to build something indestructible. Now, he would have to learn how to live with it. Winter pressed deeper into the mountains, its grip unyielding. The snow, now a constant companion, had become part of the landscape, thick and deep, covering the wilderness in a soft, merciless blanket. Samuel stood at the threshold of his cabin one morning, staring out into the horizon, his thoughts clouded with the questions that had been haunting him for days. The cabin he had built, his fortress, stood tall and proud against the storm. Yet, despite its success, despite its strength, Samuel found himself growing restless. The sounds of the wilderness, once comforting, now seemed oppressive. The wind moaned against the walls, the trees creaked under the weight of snow, and the night stretched on longer than he ever remembered. It wasn't the cold that bothered him. The cabin had proven its worth in that regard. It wasn't the storm outside. It wasn't even the bears, the wolves, or the ever-present threat of starvation. It was the realization that his cabin, while a marvel of construction, had become something more than just a shelter. It had become a cage, a prison of his own making. Samuel had spent years perfecting his craft, carving out a life in the mountains, one where survival was the only goal. But now, as he looked at the cabin, he couldn't ignore the loneliness that seemed to seep into every log and nail. The solitude had once been a source of strength, but now it felt like a weight pressing down on him. He had built his fortress to keep the dangers of the wilderness at bay, but in doing so, he had kept something else out, something he hadn't realized he needed until now. He missed the sound of a human voice, the companionship of another soul. He had shared a life with John, his old partner, and though John's death had been a cruel blow, it had also been a defining moment. Samuel had lost something that day, something more than just his partner. He had lost the connection to the very thing he was now beginning to crave: connection. A soft knock on the door snapped Samuel from his thoughts. His hand instinctively reached for the rifle, but then he paused. It was not a bear, not a wolf, but a man. Slowly, he moved toward the door, his boots heavy on the wooden floor. He opened it to find William standing there, his face haggard, his coat covered in snow. "Samuel," William said, his voice strained, I need to talk to you." Samuel stepped aside, allowing William inside. The warmth from the fire greeted them both, but it was clear that the chill between them had deepened. Samuel had spent days with William, helping him rebuild, But something had shifted. The friendly banter they'd shared in the beginning was gone, replaced by an unspoken tension. "I've been thinking about what you said," William began, his voice low, "about how you've built something that's more than just a cabin. It's a fortress, and I've realized something." Samuel raised an eyebrow. "What's that?" William hesitated before speaking again. "You've built this place to keep the dangers out, but you've also built it to keep people out. I can see it now. I see it in you." Samuel stiffened, the words hitting harder than he expected. William wasn't wrong. Samuel had spent so much time perfecting his sanctuary, his fortress, that he hadn't realized it had become more of a barrier than a shield. It was meant to keep the wilderness at bay, but in doing so, it had created a wall between him and the very thing that could make life worth living: connection. "I'm not here to accuse you," William continued, his voice softening, "but I think you know what I mean. The cabin may keep the bears out, but it's not going to keep the rest of the world out forever." Samuel said nothing, his eyes drawn to the fire. The flames flickered in the hearth, casting long shadows on the walls. He felt a weight in his chest, a nagging truth he couldn't deny. The fortress he had built had become a prison, and he was its unwilling warden. The following days passed in a haze for Samuel. His mind swirled with the conversation he'd had with William. The words had struck him deeply, more so than he cared to admit. He had always prided himself on being self-sufficient, on building a life that was untouchable, but now he wasn't so sure. The cabin had been a refuge, yes, but it had also become a symbol of isolation, a life cut off from the world. It wasn't just the solitude of the cabin that bothered him, it was the stark contrast between what he had built and what he had lost. He had spent so many years focusing on survival that he had forgotten what it meant to truly live. The mountains had always been a place of escape, a place where the dangers of the world outside couldn't reach him. But now it seemed like the only danger left was the one he had created for himself. As Samuel wandered the cabin, his eyes falling on the various tools, the maps, the sketches he had made over the years, he felt the weight of the past pressing down on him. Every inch of this place was a reminder of what he had been, an outcast, a man who had turned his back on the world. He had never questioned his choices, never wondered what might have been different if he had built something more than just a fortress. But now those questions were impossible to ignore. He thought about John, his lost partner, and how they had shared everything in the wilds, every risk, every triumph. They had been more than just partners in survival. They had been brothers, bound by the same desire to conquer the wilderness. Samuel had always believed that he could survive anything, but he now realized that survival alone was not enough. It was the connections, the shared experiences, that had given his life meaning. The cabin's walls suddenly felt more suffocating than ever before. He had thought he could build something indestructible, but what good was a fortress if there was no one to share it with? The cold had not just come from the outside, it had crept inside, settling in his heart. That night, as the storm raged outside, Samuel sat alone by the fire. The flickering flames seemed to dance before his eyes, casting shadows on the walls, but for the first time in years, the warmth they offered felt empty. His fortress had protected him from the storm, but it hadn't protected him from himself. In the stillness, Samuel made a decision. The world outside had been calling to him for too long. It was time to tear down the walls he had built, not just around the cabin, but around his heart. He stood, his resolve hardening. He couldn't undo the past, but he could build something new, something that went beyond survival. Tomorrow, he would leave the fortress behind and step into the unknown, ready to face the world once more. The cabin would always be a part of him, but it no longer held him captive. The wilderness was no longer his enemy. It was his home, his past, and perhaps his future. And for the first time in a long while, Samuel felt the stirring of hope. The morning after his decision, Samuel stood at the edge of his cabin, the air crisp and cold. He hadn't packed much, just the essentials: a rifle, some provisions, and the few belongings that reminded him of who he had once been. The cabin behind him, once a sanctuary, now felt like a chapter of his life that was closing. The mountains still stood tall, their peaks dusted with snow, but the isolation didn't feel as imposing now. Samuel had realized something important. Survival wasn't just about protecting yourself from the wilderness. It was about living alongside it, embracing its challenges and finding connection in the process. He wasn't alone anymore. He had himself, and that was enough to begin again. With one last glance at the cabin, Samuel set off down the path, the crunch of snow beneath his boots the only sound accompanying him. He didn't know where he was going exactly, but it didn't matter. The mountains had always called to him, and now he answered. The world outside the cabin awaited, full of uncertainty, but also possibility. As he walked further from his fortress, Samuel felt a lightness in his step. It was as if the weight of years of solitude had finally lifted, and in its place was a sense of freedom. For the first time in years, he was no longer trying to escape the wilderness. He was part of it. He didn't need a fortress anymore. The mountains were both his refuge and his challenge, and he was ready to face whatever lay ahead with open eyes and an open heart. The sun dipped low over the horizon, casting long shadows on the snow-covered landscape. Samuel paused, resting against a weathered rock, his breath visible in the cold air. The mountains stretched out before him, both beautiful and untamed. The journey had not been easy, but it had been necessary. It had been weeks since he left the cabin, and Samuel had encountered a variety of people along the way: trappers, settlers, even a few travelers. Each one had shared their own stories of survival, of loss, and of what it meant to live in the wilderness. Through their eyes, Samuel had seen a new way of living, a way that wasn't just about building walls, but about building relationships. In the distance, he spotted a group of settlers gathered around a fire, their laughter and voices carrying through the air. He hadn't realized how much he had missed the sound of human connection. It was then that Samuel understood he hadn't been running from the wilderness, but from the very thing that gave it meaning: the people who shared it. He walked toward the camp, his steps confident, his heart lighter than it had been in years. The journey had brought him full circle. No longer was he the solitary man in the cabin, isolated from the world. He was part of something bigger, something that went beyond survival. He had found a new home, not in the walls of a cabin, but in the hearts of those who understood the true meaning of the wilderness. Samuel smiled, feeling for the first time that he had truly come home.